So I really start talking about fire all the times I talk about fire. I talk about like our relationship to fire, and it's really this innate part of humans, of all people, and it's like been this fundamental tool as far back in the evolutionary time scale that you can like. There's evidence for. So we all have this connection to fire, and when you start looking at the use of fire across the world by different people, it really is. Related to the ways in which we care for land. And this includes Hawaii too, and I'll talk a teeny bit about that. But when we see an event like Lahaina and the fires in Kula, what we're really talking about, this is more like a symptom of how broken that relationship is, right? So I am going to talk about today, like how these fires happen, how fires are occurring, what are the kind of drivers of fire in Hawaii, but I'm also going to talk about why they occurred, why this happens in Lahaina, and ultimately like why it was preventable. And so, again, this is trying to place where the work that I'm doing and have been doing for so long in this context, and then sort of like what should we be doing, what can we be doing moving into the future. So I'll get into some of the science, but it's really more about like where we are as a society. I mean, that's really what we kind of have to confront, because the solutions to dealing with this and really preventing another tragedy that just happened, they're within our grasp. And it's important to understand all the how this stuff is happening, but then really understand like the sort of depth of the problems that we need to confront. We also have to talk about why. So I've been writing about this stuff for quite a long time. So as Wade said, for about 10 years, I was like an extension specialist just doing fire. And about a couple of years ago, I switched positions. And this was not necessarily that I wanted to, but it was more a career of stability. I was grant funded for about 10 years. And I bring these examples up not to sort of say, oh, look, we sort of saw what was coming, but that's part of the story. But also just to say that, we weren't the first, I wasn't the first person to bring this up. And this kind of perspective, the ability to kind of bring all of these people together, to recognize the work that's already happening is really important, right? So this one about Maui has the know-how to deal with fire risk. That was really in response to this kind of like, oh my God, what's going on? This was in response to the Hurricane Lane fires that happened in 2019. Just to say, like, there's people doing it. We just need to like scale this up. And similarly, this was again after the next summer, a whole bunch of huge fires in Maui. Just that we kind of have solutions to this. It's a matter of like doing it, actually implementing these things, but also recognizing that there was people that came before, and these two gentlemen in particular, Miles Nakahara and Wayne Ching. I think if I click on this, it'll probably go advance. I just want to drop this Zoom thing, but no, great. Anyway, these guys worked for DOFA. Wayne was a fire management officer, so basically like the lead fire protection force for the Division of Forestry and Wildlife for a number of years when I started doing this. And then Miles Nakahara was a wildlife biologist on Big Island, and they really saw these changes coming down the line. They saw fires becoming very difficult to deal with, this threat growing around their communities, and they were really proactive in organizing people within the fire community, so getting the state and the county fire departments to talk to each other, but also organizing the larger community and kind of seeing where the gaps were that needed to be filled. And so really, really fortunate. They both passed away in 2020. And I don't know where they would have been jumping back into right now after these Maui fires. But and one side of me is kind of glad they didn't get to see what we let happen. And I'm gonna move this thing too. So fire's changing. Look, we know this in Hawaii. We can look at a pretty long history here. So fire records start in about 1904, and this is because of a big fire that happened in 1901. About 30,000 acres burned on the windward side of Big Island, Hamakua Coast. And so all of a sudden people were like, oh my gosh, the territorial government at the time was like, what's going on? What do we do? And so they started a fire warning program, which basically was the progenitor of DOFA. Division of Forestry and Wildlife. They started the first forest reserve. So Hamakua Forest Reserve was established in the aftermath of this big fire, 30,000 acres. And they started tracking fires. So what we're looking at though over the rest of the century is pretty low fire activity, about 5,000 acres per year. And then we kind of hit maybe in the 50s and 60s, we get a big jump, and then this huge jump later on, starting in about the 80s and 90s. This peak, by the way, was one single fire. This is the largest in state history, around Ku'anapulu. So that's really, that big spike is one single fire. And so I'm going to talk about like what's going on, driving these changes, but also like why we're looking at these landscapes we are. It's just like, this is a slide to remind you guys that fire, as far as like evolutionary history of our islands, was relatively infrequent. I mean, there were fires, active lava flows, but lightning strikes are really rare in Hawaii. They don't have enough land mass to generate the clouds and the thunderstorms that you get lightning storms with. And so, a lot of our vegetation it's not that well adapted to fire, but it can actually handle the problem that we're dealing with now when native ecosystems get hammered by fire. It's the weeds that come in, right? So when we have got a lot of ecosystems in Hawaii that we don't want to burn because they don't recover back to what they used to be. And then people flip the switch everywhere on fire. So this is a study I did a long while back, and it's just looking at like, cultural uses of fire across the world. And so basically everywhere you go, everywhere you can dig up. I mean, if I only could speak Russian, I probably would have found lots of evidence out there too, but you see examples of people using fires for lots of different reasons. From controlling insects to improving pasture and improving plant quality. So like for basket weaving, use of peely grass, right? So there's accounts of Hawaiians using fire as well to manage landscapes. It's this fundamental tool, as I was saying. And so obviously when people came to Hawaii, that was really the first big switch in fire regimes here. But now we're looking at something entirely different. And probably a lot of you know where I'm going to kind of head with this, but when we see fires like this is like beyond what we want to be dealing with, right? This is getting into situations. This is Mount Ka'ala, the back is on Oahu. It's about, I don't know, like 4 months after I started this position, I got a call from Michelle Mansker, who's managing the Army environmental program. They're like, the mountain's on fire. Like, you run over and see this, and it's like, it's shocking to see these things. And when they do hammer our ecosystems, this is usually the framework that I'm kind of talking about fire, is when they have impacts like this. So this is probably was Oahu's largest stand of Wili Wili trees in Kea'au Valley that got lit up in 2018, right? And these ecosystems are not going to recover back to what they were. They're going to fill in with grass. Most of these trees died. And then the marine impacts as well, right? So once you open up all that vegetation, you expose the soils to runoff, and so this kind of slick, you can kind of see the back, and it's hard to look past the waves. So we've kind of got these impacts on marine and terrestrial ecosystems. And so this is obviously different from what we're talking about today. And obviously the interest in fire today is the impact on Lahaina and in Kula. But it's also important to remember, and this is what I really credit to my work working with the fire departments, is like, this is the concern that they have, right? It's when the communities are impacted. So this is those same 2018 fires on Oahu. This could have been the Lahaina situation about 5 years ago. We had 3 valleys burning simultaneously, burning up over the mountains into the next valley. Almost the entire fire department was on this fire, including Division of Forestry and Wildlife, trying to save homes. And they did a great job. They only lost a few structures during this fire. But this was like, when we conceived, we're getting maxed out, right? This is like, again, stretching our capacity to suppress these fires, and obviously really, really challenging conditions as well, right? So this kind of interface that we have, and it's really important, I think, fire provides like kind of this lens to understand how do like our day-to-day, lives intersect with kind of these ecosystems, either Mouth or Makai, that we care so much about. And fire is just in that interface, right? It's like in that world between, in those little physical spaces between here. And when communities are impacted, this is obviously the priority that we have. This is that same fire Makaha. And we know that this is the case across the state. Like, this is not news. It's news for a lot of people, but not for those of us who've been working on fire management here, that when we sort of look at the red as high-risk areas, there's communities on every island that are really high risk to fire. This integrates both infrastructure as well as the kind of fire risk posed by the surrounding vegetation. So really what's going on? I mean, what we're seeing in Hawaii are these changes in fire regimes that are kind of increasing risk, like where we stand, right? So it's not like in Colorado, maybe like building up in a ponderosa pine forest. We're seeing big changes over the past few decades, as I showed in that fire history annual area burn. So climate, but a lot of you guys are probably familiar with this, right? We've got very wet sides that transition to very dry sides on all the islands. But the bigger thing for us actually in Hawaii is the wet and dry cycles. And so because we're dealing with all these fuels in the lowland that are dominated by grasses, you get wet seasons, they build up tons of fuels, and then the summertime comes or drought hits and they cure rapidly, respond rapidly. And then we are also seeing some long-term drying trends in parts of the state, and Abby Fraser's done really cool work looking at that. And then ignitions, right? So we have this other component of fire regime. I didn't even tell you what the triangle was. We're talking about fire regimes here, which is, you know, there's lots of triangles in fire science, but this is kind of like how we describe patterns of fire occurrence over time. Every fire needs a start, and ignitions are almost constant. This is showing ignitions by week, done by Ashley over there. Thank you very much for this figure. It's pretty awesome. And it just shows you that they're happening all the time. And it's all human caused. About 99% of them we've attributed to humans. The vast majority, we never know how they started because we're not investigating all these fires. But we're looking at about 800 to 1,000 ignitions across all the main Hawaiian Islands every year. So it's all the time. And almost all of it, about 75% are accidental, which means they're possibly preventable. And then the big landscape change is unmanaged. This is the key word here: unmanaged non-native grasslands and shrublands. So we've got tons and tons and tons of this vegetation type, and tons and tons and tons of it that are just not being dealt with. They're just kind of left out there on the landscape. And I'm going to dig into this a bit, but this is basically creating not only this fire risk for us here, but it's really kind of a whole new animal relative to anywhere else in the world. When we're talking about, I gotta get back to this, it'll let me advance. When we're talking about fires moving to these kinds of vegetation types, the quantity that these things are attaining on the landscape is like unparalleled anywhere else I can find in literature. We're talking about 8 to 10 times the amount of a grassland you might find in the temperate US. If I was, you know, for those of you who are like maybe do forest metrics, they're like, you know, 10 to 20 tons per acre in a typical Guinea grassland. That's like forest biomass. That's like people think you're talking trees, and this is pretty much grass and halikua. And when they burn at incredibly high energy, high intensity. They move incredibly fast across the landscape, and they get people in trouble, right? I mean, look at the size and the heat that's being thrown off of this thing in this picture. These are not things that we can like go out and shoot water on and put out. They're really getting beyond our capacity to act in this sort of realm of suppression. And when we look across the whole landscape, this is the thing, I never really thought about this actually until I started looking at fire here. So I came out of botany, and you're like, want to go to the tops of the mountains and the coast where you have these nice ecosystems left. But the purple of basically all native Hawaiian ecosystems. This is outdated. It's from the carbon assessment from 2017. So like, for example, it's showing Central Maui's agriculture. But basically all the purple is like remnant native ecosystems. And then all of these grassland forests, et cetera, are non-native, right? And so that that beige, whatever color that is, that's all of these grass-dominated ecosystems. And again, we're sort of, this is just to give you guys some context, you know, more than half of our like current terrestrial vegetation is non-native, right? So we're really talking about pretty small percentage of native ecosystems, and over 1 million acres. So that's a quarter of our state land area are dominated by these non-native grasslands. So that's including shrubland areas too, where that dominant ground cover though are these non-native grasses. And when the fires happen and we have to track this, you know, the vast majority of our fires are happening in these grasslands. And so this is kind of what the context is. Like, our communities are surrounded by these grasslands. They extend right up to the foot of our watershed forests. And when they burn, that's that connectivity, right? There's like really nothing in the way to stop these things from sort of extending from the place where people are doing what they're doing, right? Setting fires by accident, sometimes intentionally, and then the impact they have, again, both on resources Mauka and Makai. The utility of this sort of fire regime idea is also, it extends into like mitigation, it extends into like what can we do to kind of stop this. I'm saying, like, when we think about the impacts to our native forests, like we don't want to see these places burn. And then when you think about the devastation in Lahaina and in Kula, I mean, this is where we need to be thinking and kind of framing this around the things that we can do before the fire and the things that kind of come after the fire. And so this is a project that I manage, this Big Fire Exchange, where we're trying to put out this kind of information. This is this graphic we put together years ago. But basically, when this fire happens, there's not a lot you can do. It's all suppression, right? You're basically in this space here. You're running out there, the fire department's running out, and they're doing everything they can to put that thing out to protect lives and infrastructure, and then maybe ecosystems. And then you're also, once the fire's put out, you're in this post-fire response. And there's also not a lot you can do there. You can try to mitigate erosion, you can replant, but you're always on the back pedal here. You're always trying to recover back to something that once was. And if you think about trying to restore an ecosystem, and now we think about the challenges that are being brought on us by trying to rebuild Lahaina, trying to clean up the mess that just got created. Like, we're out of our depth, frankly, in terms of the resources we have at our fingertips. And even what do we do, right? Plant material to caring for the trauma that people are going through, right? So where we want to need to be moving is in this space up here, right? So prevention is really talking about ignitions. That's like education, trying to get people to understand, like, don't light off fireworks if you're in a big, huge field of dry grass, things like this. Outreach and education, restricting access, for example. So, shutting down access to forest reserves potentially if the fire risk is high. And then in mitigations, what we're talking about is how do we minimize the impacts? And that is sort of increasing preparedness, with it's like the built environment. What are the things to improve water access, to improve options for evacuation? Like, so many of our communities are just dead ends, like all over the islands. It's like horrific to think about sometimes. But also then in the fuel situation, like, how do we mitigate these hazardous fuels? How do we reduce the quantity? How do we reduce the connectivity of these grasses that are just like all over the place, right? So obviously we need to be in the green if we want to really tackle this. And when we look at these fires in particular, that just happened on Maui, and everyone's really focusing on Lahaina, we have to realize that Kula was very heavily impacted as well. It's just in this sea of grasslands. We can see this ocean of grasses that are surrounding our forest areas up Mauka, and where our communities are sort of embedded. This risk really just exploded around like where we stand, as I was saying. And this is now getting into like what's going on like behind this, what's going on underneath this, right? And so when we look at land use history, both in Kula and Lahaina, like, this shouldn't be news. If anyone who knows a little bit about history in Hawaii, most of this landscape was actually formerly agriculture, right? So Lahaina, you're talking about Pioneer Mill, which shut down in 1999, starting about the 1860s. And then in Kula, this is HCNS, which shut down in 2016, right? So we actually saw this one happen in real time. And this is also not unprecedented. Lahaina burned in 2018, as I was saying, during Hurricane Lane. It's a little hard to pick this up, but you can see the fire scar going up the mountains. We had hurricane force winds. No one really expected a fire to break out, but the vegetation was dry. They were literally evacuating hurricane shelters. We lost 21 homes during that fire. Thankfully, no lives were lost. And then this 2019 in Central Maui, so this is 3 years. It took 3 years after the sugar plantation shut down, and we get about 17,000 acres burning in Central Maui. And then the areas that didn't burn, actually a big chunk over here, burned the next summer. And so it's sort of like trying to say that this is sort of inevitable in the sense that, the fuels are the problem, and we're not doing anything to manage the risks that are posed by these fuels. And this fire, particularly this Waiko Road fire, we did this sort of after action field trip to kind of talk about what went wrong, what went right, what we could have done differently. And then again, all the firefighters are telling us we need more pre-suppression. We need more actions taken before these fires happen to make their jobs safer. And really all the burden for fighting, for responding to these fires is falling on their shoulders. And this is really one of these that it burns so fast across about 9,000 acres. And this is really where firefighters are telling us they've never seen conditions like this, like never in their career, responding to brush fires, grass fires. So this is, again, we're kind of getting into this realm where it's climate change starting to have an effect now. But beyond any other signal, when we go back to the fire history, so we have annual area burned over time, out to 2022, and we try to stack this up with what other changes are happening. Just like that, I gave you a little teaser there, it really stacks up to agriculture. So this is the extent of land use under agricultural production. I derived from multiple sources and we see over time, when we get this huge decline in agricultural land use, so again, land under some form of management is really when we see this big spike in fire activity. And so it's pretty obvious like what's going on here, right? You stop using agricultural lands, you pull off that active management on the landscape, it fills in with these grasses, and now we've got thousands and thousands of more acres primed to burn when the other conditions line up. So high winds, low humidity, all these kind of fire weather conditions that we talk about. But to understand like what's going on here, right, and talking about the sort of history and future land care, we also have to kind of really confront what was happening in the past, right? And like where are we going to go on the other end of this? Because what we're really looking at here is a giant, huge and traumatic transformation of land use. Right, and so this starts about 1900, but if we really start backing it up, where this really begins is privatization of land, right? So 1848, you get the Mahele, and all of a sudden, the colonization as well, right? So you have these American business interests that are primarily American that are coming in, they're starting to aggregate large land holdings to impose commodity agricultural production. So each of these things, right? This is not Hawaiian crops. We're talking about commodity agricultural production. And when we think about the history of a place like Lahaina, this is kind of really what's come out and what's emerging out of the story is when people first arrived, when Europeans came, and what the ways in which that Hawaiians had transformed that landscape to be productive, it was a much, much different picture than what it became, right? So you're talking about really sophisticated irrigation systems, this whole idea of like abundant crop production, fish ponds, aoi, low ecolo, like you had this incredible subsistence farming system that was really just kind of ripped away from people. So this is like what we're contending with here is this process of land transformation. And what happens when plantations move in is they're diverting water, they're leveling and burning land to expand agricultural crop production. And so as this history progresses, what ends up happening in the mid-century here, the middle of the 20th century, is land use, agricultural land use goes down as labor costs rise. So you have this really militant labor movement that's starting in about the 1940s, 30s and 40s, which are demanding higher living standards. And these companies can't quite make the profits that they were making in the earlier part of the century. And so as they sort of look at this as a losing battle as far as the profit motive for agriculture, you start shifting into other forms of land use and other forms of money making, and that is obviously real estate development, right? So we've got a burgeoning tourism industry starting up, and you've got this rising middle class, right? Because of the worker movements that are like lifting wages, lifting standards of living. And so we shift, these large corporations then shift towards farming homes, basically, right? So you get much more money out of a subdivision than you will out of thousands and thousands of acres of crop production. And so this is really what we're contending with, right? It's like, how do we think about the value of these lands? How do we think about how to promote land care in this situation in which the profit motive is not going to like produce a solution here, right? Like these are continuing to decline. There's no more sugarcane production. Pasture has sort of stabilized, but has a pretty big decline. And we're living sort of in the aftermath of these big economic shifts. And that's really what we have to grapple with today to understand like where can we kind of shift things and kind of nudge things in the future. So when these guys pull out, right, when you have these big agricultural systems pull out, this is what you're left with. You get these fallow fields, they fill in with grasses, they fill in with these kind of nuisance trees like albizia that causes a whole own set of problems. And we really have very little incentive or regulation to, I would say, compel these landowners to actually take action that would reduce the risk of fire, both on their lands, right, but also to the surrounding communities and surrounding ecosystems. And I think this gives us like a sense of, people are kind of asking me like, well, what could we do? What else could we have done? And there's like so many options. I'm putting this picture in here. This is during the same 2018 fires. The whole valley in Makaha is on fire. So I'm like down at the bottom looking at the golf course, and these people are teeing off while there's like Black Hawk helicopters flying around trying to drop buckets of water to save the homes that are on these slopes, right? And so when we look at a picture like this contradiction is just like hammering us in the face. Like, what are we doing with our resources here? And what are these resources, or who are these resources serving, right? Like, to say that we can't do something else with this land is ridiculous. It's more a question of like, how can we use the resources we have, the knowledge we have, the whole cultural tradition and history that we have in this place to reimagine how these landscapes can create safer spaces for our communities. And it's a difficult one to tackle because it's not going to be driven by like a profit motive, right? This is changes that we need to make that are really for and in the interest of human health. And if we can't see this in this moment right now, you have a hard time really seeing anything, because I mean the huge impact that we're still trying to wrap our heads around with Lahaina is that it was preventable. It's just this is simple thing to say. All you have to do is drive 5 miles or so, like 5 minutes north, and here's Kanapali, right? So this is the day, like the same, this whatever, this is a month ago. You drive up there and you've got water features, you've got, golf courses, these verdant lawns. And again, in whose interest is this being served? And so I'm getting a little bit emotional here because it's really enraging when you think about what we could be doing. And in the sense of the fuels problem, the infrastructure problem, it's not beyond our capacity. It's not beyond our imagination. And there's so many models that exist before plantation agriculture and that are currently being done that kind of provide a path forward. And this question is very hypothetical. Like, what should it look like? I'm like, don't even know how to say this because I'm not here to tell you what it should look like. This is the beauty of this kind of comes in, and I like this picture because I'm hanging out with Mike Walker, who's the fire protection force for Dopa, and Bula Yaea, who's a farmer, former firefighter on Hawaiʻi, and he lives in Makaha. So we're looking at his farm, and Bula lost everything in that 2018 fire. He wants to do aquaculture, and now he's farming sheep, right? So it's kind of like turning things a little bit on its head to say, if I come at this from like a native plant perspective, I would look at this landscape and be like, oh, it's just like weeds, right? It's done. But Bula's like, no, we can run sheep. We can knock down fire risk. We can protect the homes down below me, because in Waianae, the fires always come from the back and they come down the valley. And he's at this little strategic pinch point, and he's running sheep on his farm to reduce risk to the wider community. So there's like this whole array of options, alternatives that can push us into the green, right? Prevention, all this education, and REM mitigation. And that's talking about how do we harden the homes, harden our communities, better prepare our communities to deal when there are fires, which is really the tragedy of Lahaina, right? Like once that fire moved from the brush burning around it into the community, there's very little that could have been done to stop that. I mean, 80-mile-an-hour winds, like the minute that fire sparked, there was very little that could have been done, and from an emergency response perspective. And that's what makes it so scary, right? Is that everything was hinging on the fire department coming in, and there was just nothing on this side of the equation. And now we're in here. We're in post-fire response, and we're in the dimension, I said this earlier, like we don't even understand what we need to do in this, in the context of the cleanup. So we have a lot though. We have a lot of stuff to start with. In terms of science and technology, like we've got fire risk maps, we've got custom fuels maps, this stuff I've been working on and actually was like kind of putting to the side because I'm just getting tired of no one like really caring, to be honest. we've got sort of weed risk assessment. We've got these resources that kind of point to best practices, resources that can allow us to look at where risk is high on the landscape, where are the priority areas that we need to intervene. And again, right, like even into urban Honolulu, red here is herbaceous grassy fuels, like everywhere in the state has to deal with this problem. Like this is something that's pretty big and pretty pervasive. We also have like amazing social infrastructure. So I work really closely with these guys, Hawaiʻi Wildfire Management Organization. They're nonprofit in the Big Island. And we've been working together on these different projects. And it's like when you bring these people together, people in the fire, land management community, communities, everybody who's in these areas that are fire prone understands the risk, they understand the threat. We've got amazing relationships, and we've got all this local knowledge that will serve as different forms of fuels management, from traditional agriculture. So like Eric Enos in the back of Waianae, Kaala Farm is like literally restoring Loki to act as fire breaks on his farm. To grazing, I think I've got a slide coming up on this. I'll talk about the role of ranchers. Ecosystem restoration, you've got all these crews out there that are amazing knowledge on native plant restoration, plant propagation, and trying to scale this up. And when we think about how to do this, I come back to this because it's a reminder to me, like we can't be naive about the challenge that's gonna be ahead of us to tackle this. This 1 million acres means that this is gonna be a lot of work. And so this is a question, in my opinion, it's not a question of like fancier maps and fancier models. This is more a question of like getting out and bringing people to the table to say, here's where risk is high. Here are the options that we have to potentially deal with this risk. Like, what do we want to do? And let's get the money and let's do it. Ranchers are going to be a huge ally in this, and they already are. When we look at this 1 million acres, there's about 750,000 that are still actively grazed. And they will have to say that some of the partnerships that the willingness of them to, and the knowledge that they have of using animals strategically is going to be a huge part of this, because we're not going to reforest 1 million acres overnight, right? So this is going to be like a set of lots of different, applying lots of different strategies to do this. The other model to look for and look towards are the watershed partnerships. And I love these maps because they kind of show the breadth and the kind of diversity of all the different landholders that kind of come together in these partnerships. But they're a little deceptive, I'm going to be honest, because when you talk about, like, for example, Chris Brocious with the Mount Hawaiʻi Watershed Partnership, when it comes down to it, it's Chris and a crew, like a field crew, right? So when it comes down to like the work that they're able to do, they're all underfunded, they're under-resourced, right? And so when we look at these maps, we also have to keep in this mind, and don't be naive, that this idea of land care, these models we have for land care, they're not enough. They need to be scaled up. They definitely need to start bridging down into the lowlands, into the other communities. And we need to put resources towards these kinds of efforts. Again, there's like so much to learn, so much knowledge and experience among these programs, but they need to be better resourced. And again, back to the farm, there's examples at the community level as well. We've got the Skuia folks in Waianae that I've been trying to, work with and support doing these kinds of projects, grazing. There's a DOFA is a really cool example. This is actually old, it's even crazier now, but where they're replanting native trees along this fire break road to get to the back of the fire. And so this one we're actually going to stop the fire coming across this way. And since then, this side is all now restored into native ecosystem. This is like proven, like they can work off this road now. So like green strips, this is another strategy that we're exploring and people are trying to implement. Back to Eric's farm, I mean, what should land care look like? Like, what could it look like? This is, again, it can be, use your imagination, but also it can be really rooted in what the communities want to see. And that's kind of the beauty of fire management. It just comes back to land care. And we do need some things. We need regulation and oversight. We need to basically be able to compel landowners that are unwilling to mitigate fuels to sort of come to the table. We're going to need some regulation and teeth behind that. It's going to take a lot of funding to do this. Again, this is going to be, we need like boots on the ground, people need livelihoods, right? And then this is the big one. It's been such a small community of us that have really been trying to operate at this level, like where fuels management happening, where does it need to happen in the future? So this is really kind of what we're coming down to ask for. How do we coordinate these kinds of projects? The challenge in Hawaii, it's all these piecemeal patches of landholders or landowners, private landowners. So it's a really complex landscape to manage. And then some stuff in the works. So fire prediction is getting better and better. So I worked with Tom Jambaluka and Saeed Bateni, and we're like getting to this point where we can get to like near time fire risk, where it's like we can actually look on the ground and say what's going on right now. Helping people to produce and kind of have at the ready seeds and plant materials so that we can respond in these post-fire environments, figure out what the heck's going on with soils, and then allow people to address some of these data products that are out there. And then some of the things of the future, again, plant selection, can we get better fuel maps? And then capacity assessment, like what's it going to take to actually change these landscapes? I mean, I keep coming back, this is a big task, and it's going to take a lot of work, but we have so much of the pieces in place. And like the kind of point I was trying to make, Shremokaha and Panapali, like water resources are going to be key. Like all of these actions that we want to do on the ground, almost all of them are going to require access to water. And so this is really centers this into like long-standing struggles for access to water, access to land. And so I just like, I want to enter this in being optimistic, but we also can't be naive that this is going to be challenging on multiple levels. And it's going to take coordination across lots of different players. And we just kind of try to leave on this quote. Nathaniel wrote this pretty powerful op-ed in Civil Beat. And one of these quotes that just jumped out at me is we need to plant before we build. And again, this is just this balance between where we're investing, you know, in sort of the development and the built environment. We need to be equally investing in the landscape around us, right? It comes back to land care, and we're struggling to do what we need to do because it is just absolutely undervalued from the top of the mountain down to the shore. And I think everyone in this room, at least everyone that's in NREM, you understand this, right? And so this is not news, but it's something where we kind of need to be thinking like, as a society, how do we shift gears? And if there's any silver lining to this at all, I think it's like a wake-up call for us to really think about where we're investing. And I think this I threw in there because I would say the exact same thing. Like this and all the stuff that I've written prior to this, it's the same thing. Like nothing has changed. People on the ground know what they need to do. They know what they want to see. And we just have to listen, and then we have to figure out ways to support that and make those visions for what they want their communities to look like actually happen. And so we're like serving the people in the communities that live here. And we'll be there in the future to do the work and to be able to care for this place moving forward. And so, yeah, that's really all I have to say. Thank you guys for listening.